Good morning and a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined today's webinar from Digitay, Kanban and Modus Operandi with Jim Benson. The topic of today's webinar is scaling Kanban in the enterprise, and the journey is personal. Essentially, to talk on how people who have embarked on the Kanban journey have benefited tremendously by starting with themselves and adopting Kanban in their personal processes and personal lives. And Jim is an expert on the topic and essentially the founder of Personal Kanban. And we look forward to the webinar today with Jim. Just a few items of introduction and housekeeping before we get started. I will provide you a quick introduction to Kanban and Digitay. And then hand over the presentation to Jim to continue and speak about Personal Kanban. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and we'll wrap up after that. Some of you have asked this question already, so just to make sure that everybody knows, the webinar is being recorded, and link to the recording of the webinar as well as the slides that is being used here will be made available to all of you in a follow-up email after the webinar. There is a Q&A box that you see on the bottom right of your screen, and you should be able to ask questions to Jim right in that Q&A box, and we will try and take up all of the questions that come up at the end of the webinar. And also, if there are some of you who have not been able to see the link, you should see a link for the audio conference, and of course if you haven't joined the audio conference, you probably can't hear me, but hopefully the people who are not yet on the voice call will be able to do so shortly. So with that, let me get started with introducing the speaker. Jim Benson is the CEO of Modus Operandi and a very well-known consultant in personal, team and organizational clarity. And of course, as I said just now, really the founder of Personal Kanban. My name is Matt. I'm co-founder and senior vice president of product at Digitay, which is the maker of Kanban. A little bit of introduction on to Jim. Jim has been over the years involved in building community through policy and technology for government agencies and private enterprise. He specializes in distributed team and productivity related work, and has spent a lot of time leading highly distributed teams since the early 90s in software development, public policy, professional engineering, and other knowledge work. Today he's CEO at Modus Operandi and uses lean, agile, and social media principles to help individuals and small teams actualize. He's also the developer of Personal Kanban, which is a popular lean tool for individuals and teams. One of the things that I love about Jim's presentations anywhere is that he uses the Kanban board to make his presentation, and so as you are listening to him, you're also essentially getting a quick lesson in using a Kanban board, and that's a great part of his presentation. So I'm looking forward to that. Just a quick overview of Digitay and Kanban. So we've been around for some time now, nearly 10 years. We are a web-based collaborative product and solutions company focusing on helping geographically distributed teams collaborate and work successfully on software projects and other kinds of projects. We are headquartered in, actually this should be Cupertino, California. Now we recently moved and are fairly close to the Apple headquarters. So those of you who know that will be able to find us easily. We have over 300,000 users around the world, and we have products that cover lean, Kanban, agile, ALM, application lifecycle management, project and portfolio management. And the Kanban is our flagship lean Kanban product. We have got some recognition from Gartner and other people in terms of ALM market scope and other ALM documents. And just the last slide here, a quick look at some of our customers around the world, fairly well-known brands that are using Digitay products. And we can talk a little bit more about that if there is time at the end, and if there are any questions around that. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jim. Once again, a reminder that The Q&A box is on the bottom right of your screen, so you should be able to ask questions. And as you start to think of these questions, you go ahead and enter them anytime you like, and hopefully we'll get to them as soon as we can. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jim.
Okay. Thank you, Mahesh. Waiting to get control of the screen here. As Mahesh mentioned, I'm Jim Benson. I'm the CEO of a company called Modus Cooperandi. We are a collaborative management consultancy. We work mostly with, or almost entirely with, knowledge workers, and software development, of course, is part of knowledge work. My co-author, Tony and Dee Maria Berry, and I wrote the book Personal Kanban a few years back. We've been lucky enough to receive a couple of awards for it, one of which was the Shingo Award, which was kind of the highest honor in Lean, so we're pretty excited about that. Also at Modus Cooperandi, we recently published a book by Marissa Vangen Heuvel and Joanne Ho called Beyond Agile, which tracks several companies, 10 companies to be clear, on their journey from Agile methods to more Lean methods. And so in that book, which you can get on Amazon, there are real life stories about people making the transition, and they don't pull any punches. It's not, we did this and it was great. It was, we did this and it was actually rather challenging. Here's how the challenges went. Mahesh, I'm still not seeing the control panel.
You are already the presenter, Jim, so you should be able to share. Are you not able to do that?
Oh, there it is. All right. And now we are live. So that was who I was. As you can see, I put that as extremely high priority. So today we're here to talk about process. What is process? What is Kanban? How do you use the Kanban to set up a process? And what is necessary to scale things? Everybody's really worried right now about scaling stuff, and I find scaling process to be incredibly simple. So I'm a bit amused by all of the talk that's been going on recently and things that have been invented to do something that doesn't seem to be all that tough. So let's talk about that a little bit. So what is a process? And a process is basically what we're doing, what value we're creating, and the steps that we're taking to create that value with full knowledge of the customer and what their actual needs are. Processes are usually pretty unique from place to place. Different software teams could have extremely different processes. And canned processes are useful if your team has no process and you need to get some grounding and then define your own. But canned processes are extremely dangerous if you start with them and then you keep that single process forever. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. So then the other side of that is what is a tool? And a Kanban is a tool. It's not a process. It is a tool. And with a Kanban, we can draw up any process that we are currently using, and we can watch value flow through that process, and then we can make changes to that process as we go along. And the purpose of the tool is to allow us to both create things and to get better at creating those things. So we have the process, which is the steps that we take to create things, and then the tool, which is actually something that we use within that process. So, as I just mentioned, so Kanban is a tool that helps us create our processes. So if somebody is using Scrum, or they're in a Prince2 shop, or they're doing something with Six Sigma, you can set up a board and you can track things through that process, or you're using a process that has no name, something, set of steps that you came up with in an emergent, organic fashion. The Kanban shows those and allows you to watch the work as it's flowing through. So as we're watching our work flow through the Kanban, as we're watching these tickets flow through this system here, we start to see that along the way there might be bottlenecks, there might be breakdowns in communication, there may be changes in context, there may be a wide variety of things that are impeding our ability to get work done. And quite often those impediments are actually internal. They're due to our own assumptions as individuals about what the other individuals around us are doing. So being able to see what we're doing and what our coworkers are doing allows us to collaborate better, to see where there's waste, to see where people routinely drop the ball, not because of anything that they're doing, but because we didn't actually include it specifically in the process that we're using, because we assumed that other people were already doing it. And Tony and I see this happening all the time in our clients. We will go through and we'll start to map out the value stream, which is that part at the top of the Kanban, this part right up here, which shows the steps that we take to create value. So here those steps are ready, talking, and talked. So things that are waiting for me to talk about them, things that I'm talking about, and things that I've completed talking about. We can make that more complicated if we want by setting up our own boards. And our own boards can, and I'm sure that many of the people on this call, because you've gravitated to this call, you've seen boards that are much more complicated than this. So boards that come out of using LKU's Kanban method are usually going to be much more involved, much more complicated than this board, because they're showing many, 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 many steps that are taking to create value. And each of those steps is an implicit or an explicit handoff of work from one entity to another, which gives all sorts of reasons, all sorts of ways for there to be communications breakdowns, for there to be workflow issues, for there to be bottlenecks, etc. So when we set up our board, one of the reasons why it's helpful to start from a personal Kanban perspective is because your goal initially is to understand your work. So initially we're populating our backlog here, and then we're going to start watching work flow through this system, and as it flows through, we're going to be seeing more and more where things might break down. So here we're seeing that things are breaking down at validation for some reason. And now when we see this visually, either as an individual or as a team, we can start to act on that. So the board is simply showing us what is happening in whatever our process is, and then allowing us to make decisions based on that information that we're receiving. So we want to keep our processes fresh. We don't want to use a process that worked somewhere else for some other company and then think that we can translate it wholesale into our domain. That's just not the way work works. If it was, then we would simply be manufacturing plant workers who were working on an assembly line with a high degree of predictability. But the very nature of knowledge work is that there is a large degree of unpredictability in the work. So even if we start to get our process down, that process itself has a life cycle. It decays over time. And what we want the Kanban to do as a tool, not as a process, as a tool, we want the Kanban to constantly be coming back to us and saying, the calibrations that you made in your process a few months ago are no longer valid. Or they're slightly less valid than they were before. So what happens usually with projects when you're not visualizing your project or your process is that over time, your assumption of what reality is and what reality actually is starts to deviate very, very slightly. And was that note for me? Okay, good. Sorry, that note came up and I thought it was for me. We start to deviate from our processes very slightly, and as we get farther and farther away from them, because the deviation is gradual, we don't notice that they're happening until it's too late, until the cost of reorienting the process is now very grave and very costly. So we want to use the Kanban to start to say, you know what, we're seeing slight breakdowns, very, very slight breakdowns. So like here, 3 things out of 2. That's an incredibly slight breakdown, might seem anecdotal. So you clear it up, it goes away, and then a couple of weeks later, you see that it's come back again. And if you see that start to repeat, then all of a sudden you know, I have something that I need to do, or we as a team have something that we need to do to readjust our process. Maybe it's as simple as readjusting the WIP limit. Maybe it's as simple, maybe it's more complicated. Maybe the policies and the procedures for moving things from one column to the next need to be augmented or changed. Maybe the board itself no longer reflects the actual steps that are taken. Maybe previous good actors in the organization or in your value stream have become bad actors, intentionally or unintentionally, and that's starting to have impact on your work. There could be any number of procedural, political issues that might cause you to go back and question the layout of your board. If Kanban itself were a process, then you could not do that, because the process would dictate what those columns would be, the process would dictate what the work item types would be, the process would dictate how things move through the system. So, minimal constraints in the beginning make for good process. So you can say that personal Kanban or that the Kanban method, those are processes. So in personal Kanban as a process, there are only 2 rules, and those 2 rules are what gives the process coherence, right? So the first rule is that we need to visualize our work. And that's based on the notion that we can better manage what we can see. The second constraint is that we need to limit our work in progress. Now, that's based on the notion that we can only finish so much work at a time. We can only handle work to our capacity. We can't work above our capacity. And right now, as knowledge workers, all of the work that we're doing is to some degree intangible. So it's almost impossible for anyone, even ourselves, to know what our limit is arbitrarily, just off the bat. So we need to be able to visualize it, to monitor it, and to make sure that we're actually completing work at what Agile calls a sustainable pace. So the WIP limit is the gas pedal of your vehicle of creation here. And so if you push things down, if you push the gas pedal down faster and faster and faster, and you do more and more work, it might feel like you're doing more work, but you're also more likely to crash. So a safe speed is preferable to massive speed, even though your car is actually capable of going faster. So with teams of knowledge workers, quite often people will say, well, I think you can do more work than that. So they push the teams to work faster and faster. They push the team to have more and more work in progress at any given point in time. And then when that happens, after a while, invariably, the project goes out of control and crashes because it wasn't moving at a safe speed. So this ticket is simple, this Kanban is simple, this Kanban is simple. There isn't a whole lot of explanation that I need to do for any of these, or for both of these boards. The work that is flowing through this Kanban here are the topics that I am talking about. They move through until I'm done. This might be my vanity column. But as we tackle each one, you guys on the other end of this are watching those. You're thinking probably, okay, each one seems to move at about this rate. Each ticket seems to have a certain weight to it. Each ticket has a certain definition to it. So each ticket has a story. Each ticket tells a story. And it's not a user story. It's a real story. Each ticket is a subject from which I can act. When we don't visualize our work, then, you know, the board would look like that. It would look like, you know, nothing whatsoever. And so right now what I would have to do with no board is remember all of the things that I wanted to talk about, or maybe put them down in a long list somewhere and then read them off. What I have here is a set of options. So at any point, I can finish talking about simple Kanban, and I can start talking about any of these things. I don't have to pull the one off the top, but I can start talking about any of these things depending on how the context dictates, or what the context dictates. So when Tony Ann and I go out and teach classes, we'll do 2-day classes on Personal Kanban. We will set up a large Kanban with Post-it notes on the wall, and at the beginning of the day, they will look extremely orderly. There's lessons, and then there's all the topics that we talk about during the lessons. But our classes are filled with people, like real people with brains and things. And so those people with brains and things, they ask for work from us as they need it. So they will raise their hand and they will ask a question for something that is much later in the day. Now we have two choices at that point. We can either tell them that comes up later, or we can say, you know what, you've just made something that we were going to cover later relevant now. And we will pull a ticket that was coming way in the afternoon, even if it's the morning, we will pull that out. You know, even if it's like way down here, we'll pull it in and we'll start talking about it. Because the context has changed based on the needs of the market. So that room is our customers, and our customers are pulling work through us. So we like to think that we're pulling work and we're the only autonomous actors of pulling work through this system, but our customers are actually pulling work through us. So there's a couple hundred people, I believe, on this, and if I start talking about things that aren't important to people, they will shut off their computers. So right now I have to make sure that the topics that I'm pulling and talking about here are of value to the customers that I'm dealing with. So I can't do that if I set up a rigid system. So if I did this through a PowerPoint, the PowerPoint is a linear, rigid system that is extremely hard to navigate out of sequence. If we set up our processes in business as systems that allow us zero ability to operate things out of sequence or to deal with exceptions, then we create brittle systems, and those brittle systems invariably break down as we build more and more complicated workflows. Just keep pulling this over. So those two rules of limiting work and visualizing, or visualizing work and limiting work in progress, what they're doing is they're giving us understanding. once we understand how our work actually operates, then scaling is easy. It's super simple because you understand what the work is that you're doing. You understand the context in which it's falling, both in terms of within the organization and externally. You understand what other projects are going on a little bit better, and hopefully if they're having a Kanban, you can understand what they're doing a lot better. And you can start the conversations about, okay, I've been visualizing my personal work, I've got that down, I've limited my WIP, I've slowed down enough to have time to think, I've improved some of my own processes, I feel comfortable with this, and now I want to expand that out. I want to expand it to my team, I want to expand it to my company, I want to expand it to my family, I want to expand it everywhere I can. And the reason that people get passionate about that is because, oddly enough, what you do is a large part of who you are. And when people say that they go to work and they say, I'm at work, I've closed off my personal life, I have my work life and my personal life. Well, then you have split personality disorder. You're person A at work and you're person B apparently somewhere else. You know, and you probably have a lot of worry that person A one day will bump into person B. But most people choose their profession because they like it. They're intrinsically interested in what they do. They want to do a good job. And the only thing that's stopping them from doing a good job is the fact that as knowledge workers, we're all overloaded all the time. And we can't prove that to ourselves or to anybody else when our work looks like that. So if our work is invisible to us, we don't know what we're doing and neither does anybody else. And then we get mad at other people for coming in and interrupting us, for giving us too much work, for pushing work on us and so forth. But we don't have the knowledge, nor do we have an artifact to argue or even just to say, you know, I really want to help, but I can't because, you know, I would like to help you right now, but I'm doing these two things. What is it that you would like me to do differently so that I can help you quickly? You know, do you want me to rush on this? Do you want me to rush on this? Do you want me to delegate one of these things? Or do you want me to do that thing that you want me to do after these are done? Or is that thing so important that you actually want, you know, it doesn't seem that important, but you actually want it to break my WIP limit? And you know, as we all know, that sometimes there are things that come along that are of a high enough priority that we need to break our WIP limit. That's life. It happens. We'll talk more about that later. So we've understood our work, and as I mentioned before, once you understand that work, you now can do things with that understanding. And I say knowledge is power, understanding is power. This is really powerful stuff to be able to not only personally understand your work, but to share that understanding with other people. It's incredibly powerful for you as an individual to understand what the people around you are doing too. Because your reality, especially in an office, is part of their reality and vice versa. And the more that we silo ourselves or close ourselves off in our cubicle walls, the more we will create crappy products because we're not fully aware of what's going on. So now that we become aware of what we're doing, we can start the discussions and the collaboration and the learning necessary to expand that out to our team. And when we get comfortable with what our team is doing, then all of a sudden what we see next is people start to ask questions like, well, where does our work come from? So they might have a coding, testing, integration, release kind of value stream. And then they get comfortable with that. And then they say, well, where does our work come from? And they'll add a business analyst column in it, and they'll get their BAs or their product owners or whatever we're calling a business analyst. They'll ask them to come in and participate in the board. Then they'll start to ask, well, where does our work go after it's released? And what does release mean anyway? You know, does release mean that they're one of those teams that they complete the work and then they throw it up over the wall and there's somebody else who's responsible for deploying it? If so, they might start to say, well, what if we work with more of a DevOps model? And when we got to release, we broke that release column out and it said, you know, work with the integrators to make sure that the system is stable. As they do that, they'll start to move out even farther and even farther until suddenly, for the first time ever, software developers are actually part of the company. They're no longer stuck, hidden behind constructs of iterations and sprints where they can't talk to other people. They're now actually part of the business. They start to share the business's language. They start to have real conversations with the business, and that's where you scale. You scale when you communicate. You don't scale when you use another tool. You don't scale when you involve somebody else's process. You don't scale when someone else comes in and tells you what to do. You don't scale when you add another person in between the two of you to translate your conversation into their conversation. What we want to do is use the boards to create a process that expands beyond your team, beyond all the teams, to encapsulate the entire business so that everyone knows what's going on and you can create the best product possible. So that's just visualization. I'm allowing the card to load. There we go. So the other part of this is, so we've seen our work, right? But it's key because I've seen a lot of people say they're doing Kanban and they just have a board with sticky notes on it. They're not actually limiting their width. And it's vital that you limit your width. So Personal Kanban only has 2 rules, which I don't think are too onerous. They're kind of scary, but they're not onerous. So the second one is limit your work in progress. And it's because limiting your work in progress is the thing that makes the work flow. It is the constraint that allows you to observe movement, to measure behavior, to measure outcomes, and then be able to describe them. Limiting your width is the tool, or is the rule, that allows you, is the constraint that allows you to actually complete work. Because it forces you to focus on things. So before, when we could have an unlimited width, we could start a task at the beginning of a project, find out that we didn't quite know what we were doing, become kind of embarrassed by that, and then kind of push it under the rug. And then it would sit there and it would fester until finally there was some horrible mishap or mayhem or somebody screaming somewhere that made people have to notice that ticket or that piece of work. Usually by that point, it had been pushed under the rug for so long that people had to pull it back out, completely relearn what that was, have a whole set of conversations about why it was pushed under the rug in the first place, and then go crazy trying to figure out how to go back and rework all of the work that had been done between when that was discovered and now, because the fix for that has drastic implications on the operations of the system. When you have a width limit and you have a board, and the board looks like this, you've got your 3 things there that you're focused on, and those are the only 3 things that you can have in progress, right? If this task here is incredibly difficult and things start flowing around it and around it and around it, somebody's going to notice sooner rather than later that that ticket isn't moving because it's a non-conforming object in flow. But if you have no WIP limit, there's going to be dozens of those tickets that get started and people say, well, I haven't gotten back to that yet. Personal Kanban and Kanban in general says, if you don't limit your WIP, you won't have flow. If you don't have your flow, you won't have anything to measure. If you don't have anything to measure, why bother? So limiting is pretty important. It's also the end. So when scaling Kanban, I want to make this clear. We're not scaling a process. We're using a tool repeatedly throughout an organization to gain awareness of what's going on, situational, tactical, operational awareness of what's actually going on so that people can make better decisions. The only process you ever use should come from you. Shouldn't come from somebody else. That's my soapbox. So with that, I'm going to try and figure out how to bring the main screen back up here so I can see if there's any questions. There we are.
Jim, there are definitely a few questions on the chat and on the board as well as offline, so we can go through those.
Oh, sure, let's do it.
But let me start with something of my own. I think when you said it, it really seemed to fall in, it seemed to really click when you said that when you visualize and you start to show work in a visual way, then it is then that finally software developers become part of the company and they become visible and they're able to actually get the voice heard and get into real business discussion. And I think that's exactly what we have seen not only with a large number of our customers, but also internally within Digipay and Swift Kanban. When we rolled out Swift Kanban 2 years back and decided to use it for our internal development work as well, it really gave all of us a powerful tool to start to talk and to start to have conversations with people that we knew were there but never really saw exactly what they were up to and what they were doing. So I think that sentence that he just said really made sense, that that's the way that the organization actually scales, and every single person is able to be visible, and whatever they're doing becomes visible and they're able to participate because of that visualization. So thank you for that. That was a really great insight.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's funny because the conversations, especially in software, that have happened around Kanban have, for a variety of reasons, been divisive. But the tool itself is completely agnostic. It's just saying, look at what's happening and make things better. So I do see the questions now, and there's a couple more coming in. So let's see if I can grab a couple of them here.
Okay.
It says, okay, so the first one is each team operates in its own way, so understanding what other teams are doing is not always simple, and you have to now greatly increase what you need to understand well beyond your own team's velocity. And that's true. So the larger your organization is, the more you're going to have to operate with you're going to have to create different strategies for awareness. So if the entire company is 40 or 50 people, then you have a very good chance of knowing almost everything that's happening in the company. At the moment, what you want is to start to understand your own team and then just work your way out from there. Because what comes from either side of your own team's value stream are the things that are going to be the most relevant for your team, and then that's going to be the easiest to understand. So if you work for AT&T or Tata or Toyota, you're probably not going to know everything that's happening in the company. But if you work in a group in any of those companies, then you can very easily see what's happening in other groups, you can very easily start to explore what's happening up and down your personal value stream. And then, is there a guideline for a WIP limit? Don Reinertson a couple of years ago, this was just last year, did a series of presentations on how to systematically set a WIP limit, and they are amazing. And if you want to go look those up, he did I think he did the best presentation of that at Lean Kanban Central Europe, and that would have been Lean Kanban Central Europe 2012. Just look up the video for it. My personal belief is that if you have the time and the capacity to run those calculations, then by all means go ahead and give it a try. Most people don't have the time or the inclination to do that. So what we generally recommend is to set a WIP limit that seems to make sense, and then watch that, watch how that WIP limit interacts with your work. So if you have too high or too low WIP limit, you're going to start to see unnecessary bottlenecks in some part of your process or work starvation in other parts of your process. And if you do that, then that is an indication that your WIP limits aren't appropriately set, and then you can raise or lower them depending on whether or not you want to provide more or less work downstream. So I wouldn't say that it's arbitrary, but I would say that when you begin, you're going to be fiddling with your board a lot. And that's all part of the discovery process. So the next question is, oh, that's pretty much the same one. So
Jim, there is a couple of questions down there you can see, and also another question that came privately. How do we control the cycle time if developers get busy with other teams, like deployment teams, for example? I guess the question is, are they shifting attention between boards? How do we control cycle time?
Right. So there's the first question that I would ask, because I think they absolutely should be involved with deployment, is why weren't they involved with deployment to begin with, and why would the impact to the cycle time be negative? So this is the way we've seen things work quite often, is a team working in its cocoon will be kicking out work at the end of their 2-week iterations and feeling like they are the most productive, effective, efficient team in the whole company. They throw their work over the wall to deployment, and then they go on to the next iteration, and then 4 or 5 iterations later, they start getting kickback about stuff that they released a long time ago. And that is obviously not helpful to anybody. It doesn't get caught in anybody's cycle time calculations, and it becomes confusing. And so you start to slow down because you start to fill up with unplanned work. So in my mind, the developers being involved with a DevOps or a deployment situation means that they're actually finishing their work that was previously prematurely declared done. If it slows down your cycle time, then your cycle time initially was a lie, and as you've learned more about your process, you're coming up with a new cycle time that involves more collaboration, which might look like it's slowing things down, but in the long run is likely going to include a lot less rework and a lot less unplanned work, which is going to actually increase throughput. So you may have slower cycle times that increase throughput of original tasks.
Right.
So if your cycle time is very, very fast, but half of your work is defects, then that's not so good. So next.
So there's one question which always is dear to my heart, which is how would you integrate Kanban with Scrum? Question from Richard Allen.
How do we integrate it with Scrum?
Yes. How would you integrate Kanban with Scrum?
You would take what you're currently doing in your Scrum team. You would draw up a workflow, value stream that reflected what you were actually doing, and be honest about what you're actually doing, not what the black book tells you to do, but what you're actually doing, and then limit the work in progress as people are working, and you're done. That is the sum total of integrating Kanban with Scrum. It's because one of the things is that I'm known for my criticisms of Scrum as a model, but in any situation you can release iteratively if that's what you want to do. So the 2-week iteration, I guess the bigger issue is people see iterations as something that limits WIP when that is not the case. It is something that batches WIP, but it doesn't limit it. And there's a huge difference between the two. So when you're batching something for a 2-week batch, and individual contributors start working on individual tasks, they can start 70 or 80 tasks within an iteration and not finish them until the last couple of days. And we see this quite often where we see the completion rate of user stories in an iteration be largely glumped in the last couple days of the sprint, which means that they weren't limiting their work in progress. They were doing a bunch of crap at the same time and then panic finishing it at the end of the sprint. And so if you can limit your WIP, I mean, we did this at Gray Hill Solutions when we were first starting and doing the first Kanbans in software. We were doing XP and doing a WIP limited Kanban, XP through a WIP limited Kanban, and it worked great. It was fantastic. Next.
Another question that came offline, and I guess that's something that you see a lot in Personal Kanban as well, is my boss keeps pushing work at me. How do I stop that?
Yeah, so Sunny Ann and I work a lot with administrative staff who are, as much as software people would hate to recognize it, are much more susceptible to push work than software is. And what we found is putting the board up and making sure that people know what the board represents does a few things over time. So initially you might put the board up and boss might ignore board, and that's okay. But over time, what the boss is going to notice is your board has a lot of stickies in the done column. That's amazing. Look at all of the stuff that you did. Whereas before, your boss sat in office and said, "What the hell does that person do all day long?" And so because they didn't know and you don't know because your work was invisible. So as we've made work more visible, that started the conversations that have then led bosses or led people who feed work to other people to appreciate the workload that those people have. It's also allowed downstream people to better define the state in which they need to receive work and then request that work come to them in a format that they can quickly process. So when you're overloaded with a bunch of tasks, you don't have any time to sit down and say, gosh, what's the basic nature of the work that I do? And if I received it in a certain format, would that allow me to complete things more quickly? And this, having a WIP limit actually gives you time to slow down and think, identify those types of things. And so the people above you quite often, or I shouldn't say above you, but the people before you in the value stream, they're generally not malicious. Their goal isn't to overload you. They honestly don't understand. They honestly don't understand the work that you are doing, that you're capable of doing, or what your capacity is. What we've also found is that admins who use Personal Kanban tend to get better raises than they did before, or at least anecdotally. So that indicated to me, and I think Tony and I were talking about things we need to research. I think that might be something we need to research. But anecdotally, that's telling me that the visualization of the work is leading to greater appreciation of the person. Next.
Okay, thanks. Question there, how do you deal with blocking items that are dependent on external factors like test server went down and needs hardware upgrade?
Okay. So, interesting. So there are two, well, I shouldn't say there are two, there are many kinds of external factors that can block your work. The one that you listed is, let's say that is a server going down independent of your, it's completely out of control. Your system is hosted in the cloud, and part of the, Amazon EC2 goes down, and that impacts obviously your work. That's an emergency. So there's that. Then there's the other part, which is I have handed work off to somebody else, and that somebody else has their own work, and my work isn't a priority to them. So it goes there and it dwells for a long time, and and then that takes up space in your WIP limit. So with the latter one, what we'll do is if something is stalled from something outside of our control, we will set up a column specifically for that. We call that column the pen. Other people call it on hold or waiting. But it's a column that is specifically for tasks for which you are waiting others to act, or on which you are waiting others to act. That's important because people will sneak work that they just don't feel like doing into that column from time to time, and that's not appropriate. For emergencies, like a server goes down, the tasks that are stalled because of that emergency remain in WIP. They are legally and honestly blocked, and they should take up all of your work in progress, because you should have an emergency ticket in there saying, oh my God, EC2 is down. What do I do now? And then everybody should be acting on whatever that emergency is to the best of their ability. Especially when something goes down that causes an outage or a service disruption to many customers, that's an all hands on deck action. So next, or are we wrapping up?
We are running out of time. I just wanted to respond to a couple of people who asked this question, that the presentation, the webinar will be available for recording after, as a recording afterwards. So if you missed parts of it, you'll be able to see the recording. We'll send you a link in a follow-up email. I guess, Jim, we have really come to the end of the time here. We have for the webinar. So any last thoughts? I have a short question to ask, if you don't mind. And that is that in general, what's your experience with organizations implementing Kanban? Do they start at the organizational level first and then people start to adopt personal Kanban, or is it more bottom up to where people start to first get introduced to Kanban themselves and then go on?
My best answer to that comes from David Anderson, who told me once that he was this was years ago when we were all just starting out. He came to me and he thought that people would come to his class and then they would learn about Kanban and then they would go off and do personal Kanban. And what he said was, but what he found was that personal Kanban was kind of a gateway drug. And part of the reason for that, or probably the major reason for that, is because since the rule set of personal Kanban is so small, it's extremely easy to implement in almost any situation, and then improve and improve and improve, and dare I say, complicate and complicate. But like I said, we've had people who have dealt with their kids' executive function disorders using Kanban. We've had people build decks in their house using personal Kanban. We've had Fortune 10 companies plan major initiatives using personal Kanban. So all the way down from little children up to the most complicated system possible. Starting with a simple system and then figuring out what to add to it is probably the best way to go. And what they say in cooking is you can always add, but you can't take away. and that very much applies here.
Awesome. Jim, thanks very much for a great webinar as usual. I found reactions and questions from people. They've all found it very informative and useful. My apologies to those whose questions we could not take up here, but we will make sure to respond to you either through Digite or directly with Jim.
Yep.
We'll make sure that your questions get answered. Our contact information is there on the slide last slide here, and you can reach out to Jim, or if you have a question on to Swift Kanban and Digite, reach out to us as well. We look forward to hearing from you. And with that, Jim, thanks very much again.
Thank you.
And thank you all for attending the webinar.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.